Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my singular honor to chair this inaugural session of the Terezín Declaration Conference. And it's a great privilege to be here with you today to introduce the two speakers, Stuart Eizenstat and Germain. As we have already heard, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat is a towering figure in this field and certainly well known to all of you for his untiring dedication to the cause of Holocaust justice and memory. He's currently Special Advisor on Holocaust issues to the US Secretary of State, and he has served in similar positions in previous administrations. As President Clinton's representative on Holocaust-era issues, he negotiated, as we've heard, landmark agreements with Switzerland, Germany, Austria, France, and other countries, covering the restitution of properties, compensation payments to slave and forced laborers, recovery of looted art and bank accounts, and payment of insurance policies. He's a key founder of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he currently serves as the chair of its council. Germain is the US State Department's special envoy for Holocaust issues. She's a member of the Senior Foreign Service and has had a distinguished diplomatic career, recently serving, among others, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Poland, and Iraq, as well as in Washington, D.C. As the title of this session indicates, from the Terezín Conference, from the Terezín Declaration 2009 to the Terezín Declaration Conference of 2022, this session, this inaugural session, will take us on a journey. It will take us back to the past, to the present, and look, most importantly, perhaps, to looking towards the future. As one of its key architects, Ambassador Eizenstat will bring us back to the milestone Terezín Declaration of 2009. Why is it so important? How did it come about? And what are the commitments made by the 47 participating states? But negotiating an agreement is one thing, but implementing it, as we all know, is another. So where do we stand today? And what progress have states made in fulfilling the promises of the Terezín Declaration? Finally, what is the important work that remains in the area of recovery and compensation of property, the social welfare of survivors, education and remembrance? I believe that we will hear a call to action on priorities that require our urgent attention. In addressing these questions, our distinguished speakers will essentially set the scene for the detailed panel discussions that will follow. Due to time constraints, it won't be possible for the speakers to take questions in this session, so I urge you to keep your remarks and questions that you will no doubt have for the interactive panels that will take place later on the themes that will be evoked in this introductory session. Many thanks, and over to you, Ambassador Eizenstat.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Ministers, Excellencies, I want to begin by acknowledging the remarkable, visionary, tireless, and determined leadership of Ambassador Robert Zihák, and that of the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, led by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jan Lipovský, without whom this conference would not have been possible. It's been my privilege to work with Ambassador Zihák and with my talented and dedicated colleague, Germain, the State Department's Special Envoy on Holocaust issues, for almost a year to make this conference possible. Just as the Terezín II Conference is a centerpiece of the current Czech presidency of the European Union, so too it was a major feature of their presidency in June 2009 for the Prague Holocaust-era conference, demonstrating the Czech government's abiding commitment to Holocaust justice, lessons, and memory. We should all feel the weight of history on our shoulders. Just as there were mass atrocities committed in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 1990s, we're now witnessing unprovoked military aggression and war crimes committed by Russia against Ukraine on the same European continent in which the Nazis and their collaborators perpetrated the worst genocide in human history, the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million European Jews, some 3/4 of European Jewry, including 1.5 million children and millions of other innocent civilians, including a genocide perpetrated against the Roma. Perversely, Russian President Putin is now using Holocaust distortion to erroneously justify his invasion of Ukraine, falsely referring to its leadership, including its democratically elected Jewish president, as Nazis. This cynical misuse of the history of the Holocaust and Second World War to further predatory geopolitical aims is not just shameful, it distracts from critically important efforts to grapple with the very real problems of rising global anti-Semitism, including in the United States. The use of social media by purveyors of Holocaust denial or distortion spreads these dangerous lies with unprecedented speed and reach. The Holocaust could have been avoided. Hitler's original goal was not the destruction of all Jews, it was to free Germany of its Jews, Judenrein. There was no state of Israel to offer them safety. And when Hitler watched the world, including my country, largely close its doors to German Jewish refugees and failed to forcefully respond to his calculated step-by-step measures to disenfranchise and deport European Jews, he felt empowered to destroy them. Perhaps we've learned some lessons from the Holocaust through NATO intervention, stopping the killings in the Balkans, preventing any further Balkan wars, and now intervening in Ukraine. There is a triple irony to what's happening in Ukraine today. First, Holocaust survivors in Ukraine saved themselves as young people by hiding and fleeing, and now they have to do so again 75 years later. The second irony is they fled often to the Russian Federation and to the Soviet Union to save themselves, and now it is the Russians who are forcing them to flee again. And the third irony is many of them are seeking and providing refuge from Germany, which perpetrated the Holocaust. It's inspiring to see Germany accept almost 100,000 Holocaust survivors from Ukraine. Among the million other refugees it's accepted. So they've got now almost 100 Holocaust survivors among the million total survivors they've accepted. And I made 8 of those 100 survivors in May of this year in Berlin, and they endorsed the excellent treatment accorded to them along with the refugees more generally from Ukraine, more than any other country has accepted. Here in the Czech Republic, over 440,000 Ukrainian citizens have been generously welcomed with schooling, housing, and medical support, the most percentage-wise of any country in Europe. This is absorbing the lessons of the Holocaust. Throughout Europe, nearly 40 countries have opened their doors to 7.7 million Ukrainians who've been forced to flee the horrors of war. But there's another reason why we should feel the weight of history today. And that is because this conference offers perhaps the last best hope to help the 275,000 remaining Holocaust survivors live out their last years in greater dignity than they knew in their tragic youth. There may not be another international conference with this breadth of participation in their lifetimes. To know where we most urgently must travel in the next few years, we must understand how we got here. In June 2009, through the Terezín Declaration. Its origins have never been properly recorded and demonstrated, and it shows how a few heroic people can make a difference in providing Holocaust justice. It was the result of the synergy of several parallel efforts coming together. Following the end of World War II, the fate of Holocaust survivors was largely sidelined because of the Cold War, where we spent all of our energies and focus, with one major exception: the 1952 Luxembourg Agreement between then West Germany, the young state of Israel, and a newly created non-governmental organization, the Jewish Claims Conference, whose 70th anniversary we commemorated in Berlin. This was the result of Konrad Adenauer, David Ben-Gurion, and Nachum Goldman, three heroic figures that have brought us this far. Since that time, Germany has expended 90 billion euros since 1952 to benefit survivors. In 2023, as a result of our negotiations in May of this year, they'll contribute another 1.2 billion euros to the Claims Conference for Holocaust Survivors in pensions, hardship payments, home care, and social services. During the Clinton administration, I was fortunate to lead an effort on behalf of the U.S. government for the recoveries from Swiss and French banks, which had hidden bank accounts of Holocaust victims, German and Austrian slave labor and forced labor companies, Jewish and non-Jewish. In fact, the majority of those slave labor funds went to non-Jewish forced laborers. European insurance companies, which refused to pay beneficiaries of policies killed in the Shoah, and the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art, negotiated along with my colleague who's here, J.D. Bindernagel, at the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era issues. And this is what now brings us here, because Thomas Kraus, who is here, the executive director then of the Federation of Jewish Communities in the Czech Republic, was inspired by the Washington Principles and urged upon the Czech government broadening these guidelines to include not just art, but all property and all social welfare benefits. He went to Alexander Vondra, then the Czech Minister of European Affairs. He went to Milos Pohár. He went to others in the Czech government. And along with other heroic figures, many of whom are here right now, for example, Ferdinand Trautmannsdorf, who was the Austrian ambassador to the Czech Republic and conceived of the idea of creating a Friends of the Chair, working with the Czech, Austrian, American, Israeli, German, and French governments. We drafted the legislation and the principles that are the Terezín Declaration. Christian Kennedy, a predecessor of Ellen Germain as State Department Special Envoy, and his deputy Elizabeth Nakian, and Yana Karanova, who is here today, working with the U.S. Embassy in the Czech Republic, all together made the Terezín Declaration possible. Special praise goes to the late Milos Pohár, who was devoted to the success of this conference. that occurred 14 years ago. The Terezín Declaration was the most sweeping set of international commitments by 47 countries for Holocaust justice and memory for Holocaust survivors and other victims of Nazi persecution since the end of World War II. Welfare benefits for elderly poor survivors, recovery or compensation of immovable real property, communal and religious property, private property and heirless property, identification and protection of Jewish cemeteries and burial sites, return of Nazi confiscated looted art, identification, cataloging, and return of confiscated Judaic and Jewish cultural property, increased access to archival materials, which got a big boost from the opening through the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany, and the promotion of Holocaust education, remembrance research, and memorial sites. There has been unmistakable progress since the initial 2009 conference, and we must not take that progress for granted. It revived international awareness of the broad range of challenges necessary to achieve what inevitably was belated justice, but justice nevertheless. The following year, 2010, in Prague, over 40 countries committed to the non-binding but specific guidelines and best practices for the restitution and compensation of real property wrongfully seized by the Nazis, the fascists, and their collaborators. This provided a detailed set of guidelines for the restitution or confiscation of Jewish communal, private, and heirless immovable property. My colleague Ellen Germain will talk in more detail about immovable property. I'll discuss the progress on movable property, particularly art. 5 countries have established claims processes to resolve claims of looted art based on the Washington Principles and the Terezín Declaration. The UK, Austria, Germany, France, and the Netherlands. American museums made a promising start on provenance research, which is the foundation for restitution. 2 major art auction houses, Christie's and Sotheby's, have full-time staffs in their offices in New York and London, which review all artworks that pass through European hands during the war years and will not auction or sell any art of doubtful Holocaust provenance. Christie's alone has resolved 100 claims to Nazi confiscated art. Recently, several positive steps have been taken in art restitution. France has placed the responsibility for the return of confiscated Nazi art or its compensation directly in the Prime Minister's office, following a 2018 declaration signed by one of Ellen's predecessors and myself with the then Minister of Culture, Monika Grütters, in Germany. It allocated additional funds for public and private museums for provenance research and informed those public museums they would receive no federal funds unless they participated in the German claims process that they had often boycotted. Unfortunately, and we have to be frank, most museums in Germany are not federal but are under the various lender states and communities, and many, of course, are private. They don't receive federal German funds, and they are continuing to refuse to participate. Moreover, Germany, with all of its progress, has still not come to terms and resolved the disposition of its heirless art, and should do so now. In a welcome move, the Netherlands updated its art restitution policy, including committing to more provenance research, seeking ways to make it easier for survivors and heirs to make claims, and reversing its so-called balancing test, which was contrary to the spirit of the Washington Principles. Now, I was ambassador to the European Union, and I love the European Union. I think it's one of the most important institutions in the world. But it's been on the sidelines on these issues for too long in helping to implement the Terezín Declaration. In 2019, the European Parliament passed legislation recognizing the Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art and urging the European Commission to catalog all data on looted cultural goods and establish principles for dealing with cultural property in future conflicts. I'm very pleased that the Commission is now taking a more serious look at anti-Semitism, as we heard today from the Vice Chairman, and also under the leadership of Katharina von Scherberg. There is cooperation between New York's YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and partners in Lithuania to preserve and digitize and virtually reunite YIVO's pre-war archival collection. And military archives are being made accessible through a new arrangement between Greece and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum I'm privileged to chair. In 2016, Serbia became the first and thus far only country to enact comprehensive legislation on heirless and unclaimed property, following the 2009 Terezín Declaration. Several other European countries have adopted legislation that partially addresses heirless and unclaimed property, although some have not yet put them into practice. But frankly, other countries have yet to adopt any laws in this area at all. And a helpful action that other countries should emulate to improve the lives of impoverished elderly survivors, and 110,000 of them are elderly and poor. Poland and Austria joined Germany in providing monthly pensions to Holocaust survivors who lived in those countries during the Shoah, regardless of where they are now, equal to pensions paid to their own elderly citizens. I urge every country here to do the same thing. It would be very inexpensive. There are so few survivors. But it would mean an enormous amount to allow people who suffered such indignities in their youth to live out their last few years not having to worry about how to afford rent or food. Please consider joining Poland, Austria, and Germany in doing this. In 2011, working with then U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania Ann Dursey and the Lithuanian government, we helped negotiate legislation called the Goodwill Compensation Law to make multi-year payments to the Jewish community in lieu of communal property restitution, although heirless property still remains to be done. The foundation, created under a 2011 law, assists Holocaust survivors and supports the overall well-being of their Jewish communities. Now, my colleague, Ellen Germain, will discuss this in more detail, but again, if you're looking for examples to follow, several countries have established foundations to assist survivors. Austria, Hungary, especially, and particularly the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is a model that can be followed in dealing with looted art, returning communal property, and in the year 2000, creating the Holocaust Victims Foundation to support Holocaust education, provide home care and institutional care for survivors, and restore Jewish monuments. This has also helped restore Jewish life in the Czech Republic, and my colleague Ellen will talk in more detail about other countries who have established several similar foundations. Please consider doing so yourselves, for your countries. Again, it would be very inexpensive, but a dramatic moral and ethical statement to follow the Terezín Declaration, which you signed. Our first priority should be the social welfare of these survivors. It was the first priority in the Terezín Declaration. Elie Wiesel at the conference in 2009, right here, called for action, saying they suffered enough and enough people benefited from their suffering. Why not do everything, he asked, possible, and draw all available funds to help them live their last years with a sense of security and dignity and serenity? We must repeat this admonition with even greater urgency now. At least 90% of survivors in the former Soviet Union live in poverty or near poverty today. In the Jewish state of Israel, 32% live in or near poverty, and in my country, the richest in the world, 30% live in or near poverty. So I am not pointing the finger at other countries. We all bear a responsibility. Our country initiated a new program during the Obama administration with the leadership of then Vice President Biden to assist elderly poor survivors. And I urge all countries again to follow the lead of Germany, Poland, Austria, to pay pensions and other benefits to survivors, as again the Czech Republic has done. It's a finite expense, but one will show our common humanity and desire to implement the Terezín Declaration you endorsed. As a result of its negotiations with the Jewish Claims Conference, Germany has dramatically increased its payment to survivors worldwide. In 2009, when I began serving as special negotiator for the Claims Conference, the global budget for home care, medical, and social services was 34 million euros. Today, it is over 600 million euros, and yet that's not enough, as shown by these poverty levels. All of us must join in these last few years. The Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, it was the greatest theft. Again, quoting Elie Wiesel at our 2009 Prague conference, just measure the added ugliness, he said, to their hideous crimes. They stole not only from the wealthy, but also for the poor. Only later did I, Elie Wiesel, realize that what we so poorly call the Holocaust deals not only with political dictatorship, racist ideology, and military conquest, but state-organized robbery. An estimated 600,000 paintings were confiscated, 100,000 of which are still missing. Cherished possessions, homes, and businesses were stolen and never returned. And many survivors, when they attempted to reclaim their homes after the war, were driven off or even killed. Regarding art restitution, at a time when several European countries have increased their efforts, others like Spain, Poland, Russia, Hungary, and Belarus have done little or nothing to implement the Terezín Declaration. By contrast, Croatia is working cooperatively with the WJRO on provenance research on cultural objects looted during the Holocaust by the fascist Croatian Ustashi state and then nationalized under the communists. In most European countries, too many public and private museums still do not conduct even the basic provenance research on their art collections, essential to art restitution or compensation. I urge all countries to provide funding to enable them to do so. And again, I want to talk about my own country, so I'm not pointing the finger at others. American museums, almost all of whom are private, made a good start in providing a portal to to allow a claimant to check with over 100 American museums on claims. But that software is now outdated. And indeed, our own museums started using, totally contrary to the Washington principles, legal defenses like the statute of limitations to bar claims. Our own country did this. And Congress finally intervened in 2016 with an act called the HERE Act, specifically referring to the Terezín Declaration and the Washington Principles, to make it more difficult for American museums to use the statute of limitations and other technical defenses. We're now seeing history repeat itself today, right now, because what has happened is a repeat of what the Nazis did with art and cultural property. Russian President Putin, after declaring martial law just within the last 2 weeks of the illegally annexed Ukrainian territory, is now apparently using this as a basis to confiscate Ukrainian art and cultural property. I mean, if this is not a repeat of history, I don't know what is. It's totally unacceptable. Tragically, we're approaching the time when there will be no eyewitnesses to the Holocaust. This should provide a greater sense of urgency to implement the Terezín Declaration, and to, again, with Ellen, we'll deal with this in more detail, to make Holocaust education crucial. Holocaust education is not just looking back at the past. It's learning the lessons from the past to look to the future. What happens when the rule of law breaks down, when democracy crumbles, when groups are demonized, when one group is targeted? Most importantly, I hope this conference today will not be the last event to focus on implementing the Terezín Declaration. As a way to keep our attention on the issue, perhaps countries should consider posting pledges and updates on their progress through the website of this conference and their own on fulfilling the Terezín commitments. And perhaps there can be another conference in 3 years, which Ambassador Rehak has called for a pledge for all of us to do, talking about how we're implementing the Terezín Declaration. Again, my colleague will talk about Holocaust education in more detail. But we have to combat disinformation. Permit me to close with these words. In order to chart the future, we have to understand the past. We have to understand what happens when the rule of law breaks down. We have to understand when average citizens remain quiet in the face of injustice. We have to understand what happens when governments fail to act. Let's all absorb these lessons. Let's all come back energized from this conference to implement fully the Terezín Declaration. Thank you, and it's now my privilege to call on my colleague who spends every waking hour on these issues, Ellen Germain.
Maybe not quite every waking hour, but many of them. And Stu is a very hard act to follow, but I will do my best. And I will also do my best to keep this brief so that we can all go get the caffeine and other things that we need to keep us going through this very important conference. So thank you, Stu, for that really wonderful firsthand account of the origins of the Terezín Declaration and for your insights on so many other areas that you had firsthand experience with. And thank you, Nicolas, for your wonderful introduction, setting out the context for our remarks, and of course to Robert Jehak and the Czech government for organizing this. In support of Holocaust restitution, commemoration, and education, the United States Congress passed the JUST Act. That required the countries that had committed to the Terezín Declaration, that required a report on the part of the State Department assessing how countries that committed to the Terezín Declaration have done in the years since the Terezín Declaration. So our report making that assessment was produced and published in 2020. Congress did not require the United States to assess itself, but we have also tried to live up to our Terezín Declaration commitments. There are about 16 major Holocaust museums in the United States and innumerable other research centers and memorials. In 2020, Congress authorized $10 million for education, which was given to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to develop materials and resources for Holocaust education within the United States. We definitely still have a lot of challenges. Only 22 states out of the 50 states in the U.S. require Holocaust education, for example. I know one of the most sensitive areas that the JUST Act, that the Terezín Declaration and the JUST Act report dealt with is private property restitution. And I recognize how difficult real property restitution is, but there are certainly creative ways to handle that challenge. On the one hand, for communal property, such as synagogues, community centers, schools, and cemeteries, actual restitution is in order, and there are many ways to approach it. For example, Poland passed an admirable 1997 communal property restitution law, but approximately half of the 5,500 Jewish communal property claims that were filed under that remain unresolved, and approximately half of the adjudicated claims were rejected. Lithuania established a fund to support its remaining Jewish community. Another creative suggestion is to consider what was done in Hungary, where an endowment created by the government can be used to preserve the Jewish heritage and culture of that country. On the other hand, when it comes to private property, I don't think anyone is suggesting that 75 years after the end of World War II, current residents of homes, buildings, and businesses should be dispossessed or pay the owners out of their own pockets. But as we discussed before, there are also creative solutions for that. For example, government funds can be created to pay a percentage of fair market value. There's also a symbolic value to a level of restitution or compensation. It's very important for survivors and their heirs to have that acknowledgement that a great wrong was done to them. There was little time to create successful restitution programs before the communist regimes nationalized private property after World War II. However, since the end of the Cold War, Holocaust-era confiscated property is often specifically excluded from post-communist restitution legislation. In other cases, claimants were limited by citizenship and residency requirements, as in Croatia. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Belarus have yet to pass legislation that provides for the restitution of private property. Poland is the only European Union member state with significant Holocaust-era assets that has not enacted comprehensive national legislation for Holocaust-era private property. Romania has Holocaust-era property legislation, but the claims process is very difficult for foreign survivors. But there has been some progress since 2020 when the US released its JUST Act report. As Secretary of State Blinken mentioned, the Luxembourg Agreement of 2021 was historic. Latvia, earlier this year, passed legislation providing 40 million euros to the Jewish community of Latvia in compensation for communal and heirless properties. The fund will help Holocaust survivors in Latvia restore Jewish heritage sites, and it will support research on the Latvian Jewish community and on Latvia's Jewish history. And that leads to the issue of commemoration and education. There are inevitably fewer living Holocaust survivors every year. And as we heard from Avraham Roth just a few minutes ago, hearing from Holocaust survivors themselves, hearing their testimony is one of the most effective ways to teach about the Holocaust. Since that will inevitably be impossible, it's ever more important to find innovative ways to teach and commemorate it, particularly since there's an appalling lack of ignorance, especially among younger people, about the Holocaust. And Minister Meirav Cohen mentioned some of the statistics that reveal that appalling level of ignorance. Equally important as we look to the future is the need for accurate Holocaust history and commemoration, which are being challenged across Europe by Holocaust distortion and denial, even as Holocaust survivors dwindle in number, and despite extensive commitments by European governments to education and commemoration. Holocaust distortion is also fed by rising levels of xenophobia and nationalism in some countries. We see the rehabilitation of historical figures who played roles in committing the crimes of the Holocaust. Some, like Jonas Noreika in Lithuania and Stepan Bandera in Ukraine, are considered national heroes because they fought against Soviet tyranny, but they also collaborated with the Nazis. Croatia still has streets named after officials of the Nazi-allied Ustasha regime, which killed tens of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Some countries downplay or ignore the role of local collaboration in helping to perpetrate the Holocaust as they try to develop a heroic narrative of their national histories. But all countries need to face up to the reality of their history, the bad as well as the good. And indeed, as Stu referred to, the United States itself is only now facing up to the fact that we made it very difficult for hundreds of thousands of refugees, including Jews fleeing the Holocaust, to enter the United States before and during World War II. So as we consider how to fulfill our Terezín Declaration commitments in the future, commemorating Holocaust distortion and denial, particularly online, is becoming increasingly important as a component of supporting accurate Holocaust commemoration, and that's an area that my office is focusing on. We are also working with our German colleagues in the framework of the US-Germany Dialogue on Holocaust Issues on that and other areas. The strength of the Terezín Declaration is in the breadth of issues that it covers and in the commitment of its 47 signatories to fulfilling all of their commitments. We can honor Holocaust survivors by meeting the commitments we undertook voluntarily in 2009. Fulfilling restitution commitments while survivors are still alive is a direct acknowledgement to them of the great wrong that was done to them. And by focusing on accurate history education, and commemoration of the Holocaust, we can teach future generations about our past and about the horrors to which hate can lead. Thank you very much.